Hey folks, thanks for coming out. Today's lecture is going to focus, of course, on NGOs and world society. And what we're going to do is trace a little bit of the background of the NGO movement, how it's shaped world society. We're going to go through a couple of ways this has occurred, and what some of the implications might be for us right now here today. So in terms of our learning objectives, what I want you to do at the end of this module is understand the background of the contemporary NGO movement. I'm going to give you some history and some facts I want you to be familiar with. Consider the idea of NGOs as carriers of world culture. This is an idea we've already started to explore and that we will continue to explore going forward. And last but not least, I'm going to go into a couple of case studies with you all, one focusing on climate change and the other on development-induced displacement, and the NBA, which does not stand for the National Basketball Association, but stands for an Indian NGO, as one example of NGO activism, focused on economic development and development-induced displacement. So, what is an NGO? Our text gives us voluntary associations of individuals, groups, or corporations who band together to pursue specific activities on a worldwide or regional basis. Sometimes you'll see people using INGOs, sometimes you'll see people using NGOs. I tend to use both interchangeably, to be honest. Lots of folks argue that INGOs, international NGOs, is kind of a dated term, simply because almost every issue that NGOs deal with today are by definition global issues as well as national or local ones. The term NGO emerges more and more frequently in the 1990s, as you see from that little chart I put on the bottom of the slide, as the ideas of public interest groups and private interest groups fade from public consciousness in the 1990s. Those are older terms, they used to be used much more frequently, and by the early 90s, NGO is the term of art to talk about a non-governmental and at least theoretically civil society building organization or group on the global scene. Logically, NGOs and other pressure or interest groups can be sort of seen to be synonymous, but the tendency is to hide behind NGO as a catch-all term. Saying you're part of a pressure group doesn't really sound so good. Saying you're part of an NGO sounds much better. So people tend to use NGOs to kind of shore up their image and to look a little bit better. So where do NGOs come from? And here's the big thing I want you to know is that NGOs are not new. We have had NGOs basically for as long as we have had, let's say, the more advanced forms of the modern state system, so getting into the 19th century. By World War I, there were multiple leagues and committees for humanitarian concerns that would be called today NGOs. 1919, the International Red Cross, Red Crescent, is created, one of the world's most long-standing and visible NGOs. 1931, the Liaison Committee of Women's International Organizations basically is a group that brings together 10 separate women's rights NGOs, who up until that point had been lobbying the League of Nations on women's rights. The League of Nations, of course, was the precursor to the United Nations. It was not a very effective body, and unsurprisingly, they mostly ignored the concerns brought to them by women's organizations and women's rights NGOs. Fast forwarding into after World War II, so 1960s, there's going to be a real kind of like a really major shift in how people see NGOs and in their role in global society. And my argument is that this shift kind of happens for three separate reasons and in three separate phases. One is humanitarian crises, and especially the media role of humanitarian crises. 50 years earlier, if there was a famine somewhere, there weren't TV cameras everywhere because there wasn't TV. By the 60s, TV crews were able to go to famine sites. They're able to go to places where humanitarian disasters are occurring, and as a result, mobilize and galvanize public support. So, for example, the famine in Biafra. Biafra is a region in southern Nigeria which attempted to separate and become its own country in the early 60s. The famine in Biafra was very heavily covered and led to lots of involvement and even the creation of a number of NGOs. Alternately, the nuclear issue in the 1960s and down through the 80s and 90s was a major issue for many non-governmental organizations. You had movements like AND, which stands for European Nuclear Disarmament, really focusing on this and mobilizing around this. Number two, environmental policy into the 1970s becomes a big driver for NGO involvement. And last but certainly not least, women's rights in the 1980s and 90s. So down the years, we see this increasing number of non-governmental organizations getting more and more involved. You have some of the numbers over there on the right-hand side of your slide. So what do NGOs actually do? And this is where this gets a little bit more controversial. In my view, there are two sets of things that NGOs do that we can identify. One is that they threaten. But I obviously don't mean that in any kind of violent way. I mean that they engage in tactics that are designed to alter the behavior of governments or of private companies. So these are tactics like naming and shaming, for example, calling out companies for their use of underpaid labor and for the use of factories where workers are systematically mistreated. This is sometimes referred to as the Nike problem, which we've read about before, precisely because one company becomes associated with a certain kind of negative practice, which then leads potentially to boycotts and other actions. In the case of companies, this is usually referred to as a corporate social responsibility or CSR sort of issue and is designed to prompt change in that regard. NGOs can call for and lead boycotts, for example, the tropical timber movement. NGOs, of course, engage in all forms of media activism, lobbying, agenda setting, and so on and so forth. Does it work? Well, yeah, actually, sometimes it does. And we have a couple of examples over here on the slide. On the whole, developing countries, that are named and shamed by human rights NGOs do in fact receive less foreign direct investment, aka investment from abroad, than those who are not so targeted and named and shamed and boycotted and so on and so forth. So we have some evidence that what NGOs actually does have some kind of effect. A more recent example occurs starting in 2015. When, after Aung San Suu Kyi comes to power in Myanmar, Kirin, the beer company, invests in Myanmar and actually spends $560 million to buy a majority stake in Myanmar Brewery. This seems kind of anodyne, but there are a couple of things you really need to know to understand how this becomes a controversial issue. First of all, Myanmar basically engages a business relationship with MEHL. They're right down, I can't really highlight that, but MEHL, which is the Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited Company. And this seems like a nice, productive business relationship. Basically, a foreign company is partnering with a local holding company to invest in an important economic sector. Everybody benefits. Economic growth is good, right? And so forth. And of course, economic growth really is good. But MEHL is actually very, very tightly associated with Myanmar's military, the Tatmadaw. And I apologize if I've mispronounced that, which is a very distinct possibility. So, in 2015, Kirin makes this initial investment. In 2017, they purchase a stake in Mandalay Brewery, again with a joint venture through MEHL. And in 2019-2020, Amnesty International puts together a report identifying MEHL as basically a front organization for Myanmar's military. I'm exaggerating slightly in saying that, but basically the company is heavily invested in the military. Many former military officers work for them. And basically what Kirin is accused of doing and stands accused of doing is funding Myanmar's military, which of course is responsible for a number of serious human rights violations, including but not limited to in the direction of the Rohingya or Muslim minority in Myanmar. Long story short, Amnesty International's attention, and then the attention of media outlets like National Public Radio and the BBC, leads to Kirin disinvesting in MEHL, dropping its investment because it doesn't want to be seen involved in supporting Myanmar's military. So we can take examples like such as these and sort of say, oh yeah, okay, so there's actually some evidence that NGO tactics kind of work, they kind of produce results, or at least they can in some context. And this is, an argument in support of the idea of NGOs as important actors in globalization. Okay, and here's the second argument, which is that NGOs as agents of rational voluntaristic authority are really, what they're doing is less about opposing specific governments or opposing specific companies, but about building civil society, about mediating between the state or the government and the private sector, and about creating the kind of expertise, knowledge, savvy, understanding that then allows certain kinds of change to take place. So, for example, in the case of women's rights, the argument might be what NGOs did is that, yes, they weren't necessarily very effective in boycotting companies or in boycotting governments over women's rights, but they nurtured a set of ideas of women's rights as human rights that then became part of the common sense of globalization. And while some, of course, oppose this common sense, the very fact that it is the common sense then becomes an issue to be dealt with by those who wish to oppose it and not respect women's rights. And we have a couple of different case studies over here which sort of illustrate this civil society building capacity. And I'm sorry, I don't have the circle enabled on these slides, so I can't circle this. But that basically point to the civil society building capacity. Your readings for this module talk a little bit about the 5 world culture and world society principles that you should, of course, be familiar with. And there are lots of examples of this. For example, NGOs collaborating with state authorities in developing countries very often in order to provide public health services and public goods. Sorry about that. Basically, health services and public goods in all sorts of areas, and basically building up civil society capacity. And the schematic I've put together on the right-hand side over here, of course, is meant to illustrate this. So a couple of examples of this, and I know I've just given you a big wall of text here, but climate change is one, and it's the subject of one of our readings, and it's an important one. So basically, climate change turns into, down the years, a kind of natural laboratory for understanding questions around the impacts of NGOs on states and state behavior. 1992, the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change at Rio, is drafted and put together. A global system of meetings, targets, assessment tools, evaluation tools are assembled. The parties meet every year in a different city. COP stands for the Conference of the Parties. And NGO involvement is seen as really crucial to this issue. As time goes on, though, and this is something the chapter really traces, NGOs are trying to strike a balance between, on the one hand, being true to their purpose, dealing with large global problems in multiple dimensions, pursuing agendas on justice and equity and so on and so forth. And that's on the one side. And on the other side, actually being influential in their relationship to states and state parties. And I like this case study because it's really sort of showing you this as a balancing act. It's not that NGOs are good and states are bad, or states are good and NGOs are bad, or anything ridiculously simple like this. It's that there's this balance to be maintained between, on the one hand, basically being heard by becoming closer to government functions, but on the other hand, really insisting on the need to, for example, respect the 2 degrees Celsius ceiling in terms of climate change in order to hold governments' feet to the fire, so to speak. And so there's a whole bunch of what you might call civil society building behavior and civil society building activity that NGOs do and struggle to do and argue over, that the chapter is trying to sort of help us see and help us understand. If we get into the specifics of it, we see three areas where, let's say, the fault lines with NGOs and their disagreements come to the fore. Burden sharing between northern and southern or rich and poor countries being one of them. Two, the use of market mechanisms. To make a very long story short, under climate change agreements, very often it's possible to buy your way out of emissions reduction requirements through various complex mechanisms. Which ones work, which ones don't? Should NGOs even be endorsing such mechanisms in the first place? And we get into a lot of really fascinating conversations about what the purpose of NGOs really is in this context. And last but not least, local versus international tensions, and the chapter kind of goes into all of these. What can we conclude here? Really, the NGOs have a civil society building capacity. Global civil society is a real thing. And yet, at the same time, the relationship with states can be awkward and complex and contested and really not very straightforward. The second case study, though, that we have is on dams and on development-induced displacement. I have some data on the slide over here and some statistics on the slide around the growth of hydroelectric dams as a way of generating water and power. And of course, this has been very controversial because on the one hand, dams have been seen as the green technology, right? It's a way of getting away from coal. It's a way of getting away from nuclear energy and so forth, all of which, in many cases, we would just identify as really good things. At the same time, hydroelectric dams have created a number of controversial issues, including but not limited to development-induced displacement, aka economic development projects that wind up making tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people effectively homeless. So a couple of examples on the slide, but the one I want to point out to, since we have a documentary on this, is the Sardar Sarovar hydroelectric project. It's the keystone of a number of projects in the Indian provinces of Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Madhya Pradesh. I apologize once again if I'm mispronouncing those names. And is basically, historically, has displaced over 200,000 people, affected the lives and livelihoods of over 1 million people, and has been involved in a number of controversies over the years. To make a long story short, in the 1970s and 1980s, the NBA basically starts to lead an NGO-led campaign to oppose the completion of the dam project, which eventually leads to the Morse Report and to the withdrawal of funds by the World Bank. And this is something the documentary talks about. The World Bank, conscious of bad publicity and also conscious of the fact that its role is no longer necessarily a constructive one, withdraws. The Indian government continues to seek out private sector partnership and so on and so forth. And in this story, the role of the NBA, the role of the Narmada Branch Andolan, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is actually really, really crucial. Because they're the ones, in a way, who are sort of, the cart driving the horse. They're the ones who are pushing states to be conscientious about development-induced displacement, pushing the World Bank to draft guidelines on development-induced displacements, precisely so that the bank isn't funding projects that are going to lead to hundreds of thousands of people becoming homeless in major cities. And of course, this is an issue, although the documentary itself is a little bit older, this is an issue that has continued on in India and throughout the world for some time. It was a little bit uncanny, but actually the official completion of the dam took place in September 16, 2017, literally about an hour before I was scheduled to teach a class on this very case study. So it couldn't really have been more relevant, but the underlying point, of course, is is that the dam and the the changes that occur to the landscape of people's lives through hydroelectric projects, obviously they can have very good effects. But at the same time, they can have all sorts of complex and not so positive effects around displacement, rehabilitation, relocation, and so on and so forth. So I hope this kind of gives you a little bit more of a sense of the role that NGOs have played in several prominent cases in globalization. As always, I look forward to reading what you have to write for this module.